Welcome to the first of this new series of Vice-Chancellor's lectures, which we'll be having every a couple of months, and it's a pleasure to see so many people coming to this event. The idea is that we use this as an opportunity to welcome to the campus a distinguished speaker who challenges us in some of her or his ideas about the future of scholarship, the future of inquiry across the disciplines that particularly interest us. Anyway, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Pete Lunn to give the first of this series of Vice-Chancellor's lectures. Pete.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for the invite to kick off this lecture series. I very much hope that I can repay the compliment over the next 3/4 of an hour or so. Some images you may be unfamiliar with. I'm going to suspect you're familiar with this one. We brand everything these days. My institute brands stuff too. That's its logo there. The Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin is where I'm from. Part of the Economic and Social Research Institute's mission is to try and spread new thinking and new ideas. We often tell people that we are Ireland's best think tank, or most prominent think tank, which is largely true, but it's largely true because we're Ireland's only think tank, really. But that's what we're about. We're about producing public good research that has applied policy conclusions, and that's pretty much what behavioural economics is. Now, it would help me greatly, as I start off tonight, if I could get some idea of how much you guys know already. So I'm really interested to know, and we're going to be interactive throughout tonight. You can't just sit back and expect to get away with nothing here. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, okay? And I'm expecting you to answer. Please don't be shy. If I ask for shows of hands, there are going to be some. Please put your hand up and take decisions as intuitively as you can, because we're going to do some experiments as well, okay? So what I'd like to know first of all is how many people have heard of behavioural economics? How many people actually think they know what it is? They could sort of define it and have a pretty good idea what it is. Okay, and has anyone read any books on the subject at all, full books and stuff? Okay, that gives me a pretty good idea. Now, I'll start off then with what behavioural economics really is, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of it. I'm going to tell you why I think at the moment things are really happening in my field, give you a flavour of what that's about. And if I can achieve that in the 45 minutes, then I'll think that's a success. That's what I'm trying to do, okay? This is what happened. This other image you'll be unfamiliar with up here is what happened when my publisher gave the book to a graphic artist and came up with this. Now, his idea here was that behavioural economics seemed to be accepting the fact that there was this huge complexity and difference amongst all human beings, and yet they shared something in common. So he came up with the footprint. And then he also came up with the idea that not only are they the footprints of now, but there's also a footprint from the past in the way people are, and hence one of the sets of footprints is bare feet. I guess I'm a scientist. Most of that pretty much flew over my head, but he's an artist, and I bow to his superior interpretation of my subject. There are flavours of all of those things as we go along, but I'm not going to think of this as an artist. I'm going to think of this as a scientist, because what behavioural economics is really about is the interplay between theory and evidence, and what I'm going to try and do is give you a flavour of that as we go along tonight. Now, it happens that my subject, for whatever reason, and I will come back to this, is all the rage at the moment. Here's The Guardian. Conventional wisdom doesn't take into account human unpredictability according to the new discipline of behavioural economics. Let's flip to the other side of the political spectrum. The Daily Telegraph. For centuries, economics has relied on the idea that humans are essentially rational, but behavioural economics, a relatively new and fashionable corner of the discipline, has used economic and psychological experiments to show that often this simply is not true. It's not just journalists. The European Commission's been holding lots of conferences in my subject. Recent insights in behavioural economics question the standard assumptions of neoclassical economics, identify new challenges and opportunities. And here's Lord Turner, Chairman of the Financial Services Authority. Some of today's most interesting economics, behavioural economics, is focused on the analysis of people's actual decision-making processes, deriving insights from psychology and indeed neuroscience. Today's economics, new challenges, recent insights, new discipline, new and fashionable according to the Daily Telegraph. I'm not sure whether I'm complimented there or not. So something is happening, okay? And what I'm going to really try and do is give you a flavour of what is it that's happening. Actually, despite all those references to new and recent, behavioral economics is celebrating its 30th birthday. The first paper in behavioral economics was published in Econometrica in 1979. And what we're about to do is an experiment from that very paper. And you guys are going to do the experiment. The best way to understand behavioral economics is to be one of the subjects. It's to put yourself in the position of the economic decision maker and instinctively decide what it is that you would do or what it is that you do in such circumstances. So look, here's a scenario. This, incidentally, is you. I've played around with Stickman and I've found that that hair length just about gets people 50-50 on whether it's male or female. Okay? So that's you, okay? And this is you in scenario 1. I'm a generous man. And I'm going to give you £30. And I'm then going to give you a choice, okay? You can choose option A, which is that even more generously, I'm going to give you another £10. Or you can choose option B. And option B is you can now take a 50-50 bet. If you win the bet, you get an extra £20. If you lose the bet, you get nothing more. Now, this is where we get interactive. Who would take option A? Your lack of shyness is admirable, thank you. Who would take option B? Okay, I'd say we've got about a 65-35 split. Okay, let's move on to scenario 2. In scenario 2, I become even more generous. I've given you £50. But this time, you only get the £50 on condition you do one of these two things. You can either take option C, which is you've got to give me £10 of it back. Or you can take option D, which is you can take a 50-50 bet. If you win, you keep all 50. If you lose, you have to give me 20 back. Okay? Now, who's going to take option C? And who's going to take option D? You're pretty good. You're pretty much what the paper said. Now, of course, the paper didn't do the two things on the same subject, because if it had, the smarter ones would have realized that the two problems are identical. These two problems, you're in exactly the same situation. Okay? You either have £40 for definite, or you have 50-50 on £30 versus £50. The situation is identical. The only difference is it's framed in a different way. In this case, you've been given 30 and you get extra gains. In this case, you've been given 50 and the bet takes place in losses. When this experiment's done for real, what you guys did, which is that majority narrowed in the second case, is exactly what happened. About 2/3 to 3/4 of people in the first scenario choose option A and take the certain 10. In the second scenario, about 2/3 to 3/4 of people take the bet. Faced with identical circumstances, people behave in a different way, depending on how the problem is framed. So that was the original behavioral economics paper. And what it showed, in fact, and what research has shown since, is that we don't like risk when we're trying to make gains. We prefer certainty. When we're faced with losses, we become gamblers. And we try to take risks in order to avoid losses. And this is one of the findings of behavioral economics. Okay, so that was the original paper. Why does any of this matter? Well, we'll do some more experiments in a moment, but let me now give you an official definition of behavioral economics. What behavioral economics is very straightforward. It's the empirical study of economic behavior, just like that experiment. It involves laboratory experiments, field experiments, some surveys as well, but it's mostly experiments. It's mostly work on individuals, or as economists call them, consumers, and some work on firms. And this is a crucial point. Doing these experiments will be largely pointless unless the assumptions of orthodox microeconomics are flawed. Now, what do I mean by that and why am I saying it? What I mean by that is the assumptions of orthodox microeconomics are that to at least a good first approximation, people can be treated as self-interested, they can be treated as rational, and they can be treated as behaving independently, at least to a good first approximation. Now, there's not a lot of point doing these experiments if these things simply turn out to be true. All of the economic models of the last 50 years will simply turn out to be correct. So what really tends to unite behavioral economists, and what most behavioral economists believe, is actually that these empirical studies that we do suggest that these things aren't so good. These things hugely matter. If these are wrong, the Treasury forecasts are wrong. If these are wrong, the drive for flexible labour markets doesn't have any theoretical foundation. If these are wrong, competition policy isn't based on a theory that works. That's why this stuff matters if it turns out that these assumptions aren't very good. Okay. Now, that 1979 paper in Econometrica was not the work of two economists. It was actually the work of two experimental psychologists. And this is where the interdisciplinary stuff comes from. The driving force behind behavioural economics actually comes from psychology and to some degree sociology and political science as well, with a nod in the direction of some mathematicians too. And these are experimental psychologists were Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize for economics, even though he's a psychologist, in 2002. Tversky would have won it too, but unfortunately he died young in the 1990s, and Nobels aren't awarded posthumously. They were the people who developed it. And reading Kahneman was a huge moment for me. And there's a particular quote I'm going to give you now. When he looks at that list of assumptions that economists make about human nature, about the way we are, the idea that we can be treated as self-interested, rational, and independent, Kahneman said this. And when I read that, I couldn't have identified with it more. As a neuroscientist who went back to study economics, I went to my first microeconomics lecture, and I saw those fundamental assumptions of the consumer and the worker, and I went, you're kidding, right? This is what it's all based on? And having been kicked around the room by economists for some time, that was a real moment for me. I think it was the moment when I was bound to leave journalism and go back into research. And I discovered behavioural economics through reading Kahneman and through this approach that said, if we experimentally look at what really drives people's economic behaviour, it may really change something, because the theories that we have at the moment, to anybody who's got a training in any kind of life science, well, you'd at least want to have a crack at them, I reckon. Okay? So let's do some more experiments and see how they do. This is an experiment that leads to a thing called the Endowment Effect. So, we're in scenario 1. In scenario number 1, you arrive at my research institute to fill out a survey, but I give you a gift. It's the kind of thing Brits and Americans leave Ireland with on a regular basis, and people on my island make an awful lot of money selling them. I'm going to give you that as a gift. You do my survey. And as you leave, I say to you, do you know what? I'll actually buy that mug back off you. How much do you need for it? What's the minimum I need to pay for you to give it me back? So, here you are. You've come and done my survey. I've given you the mug, the souvenir mug. How much do you want for me to buy it back off you? Somebody give me a price. 50p. £7. Sorry? Oh, you've been doing a survey for me for about 40 minutes. But this isn't payment for the survey. You might have got payment for the survey. It's just a gift. €. Okay. All right, that's scenario number 1. Let's do scenario number 2. In scenario number 2, you arrive to exactly the same survey. You do my survey. And as you leave, I offer you the mug. And I say, would you like to buy one of our souvenir mugs? How much will you pay for it? How much would you pay to buy one of those mugs? Right. Now, you've done exactly what happens, right? What happens when you do these experiments for real is people's valuations of what things are worth change depending on whether they already own them. Okay? And the standard result is actually that something you own tends to be valued about 2 to 3 times as much as something that you don't own when it's exactly the same object. Now, from the point of view of orthodox microeconomics, this is really troubling. Right? And as of now, this is an ongoing research area. This is what my current research project is actually about. Trying to understand exactly what drives this behaviour is a live research issue, but the effect is very large, 2 to 3 times more you value it if you own it when it's exactly the same object. Now, orthodox microeconomics says that shouldn't happen. You know, if you're offered more for it than you value it as, you should accept the money, and if you can pay a price for it that's less than you value it as, you should buy it. There shouldn't be a 2 to 3-fold difference in the way people value stuff. If there is, and I'm delighted when I walked in here tonight that it was up on the board, if that's true, this is in real trouble, right? Because that is all based on the idea that people have a reference price against which they're comparing things. This is a classic experiment. We still do not understand this behavior. I have my own pet theory that I won't bore you with now, but it's a very important experiment. Let me show you another one. Here comes scenario number 1. I'm getting even more generous. I've actually offered now to give you £100 today. Or, instead of taking the £100 today, you can come back tomorrow and I'll give you 110. Now, who's going to take the 100 today, right now? And who's going to come back tomorrow and take the 110? I'd say it's 50-50, maybe 60-40 in favour of tomorrow. You're a very patient bunch. Let's move on to scenario number 2. You can have £100 in 30 days, or you can have £110 in 31 days. Who's going to take the 100 in 30 days? I'm amazed. Who's going to take the 110 in 31? Okay, there's still some who are going to take the 130 days. The point here is that we haven't priced time consistently. The one-day delay has a completely different price. There are people who'll take the 100 today instead of the 110 tomorrow, but they won't do it in this case. They switch. They'll take the 110 in 31 days. The one-day delay is priced completely differently, depending on whether it's in the immediate or further into the future. Okay? So again, we've got a problem because, again, the orthodox view of economics would say that shouldn't happen. That day should be priced. It should have a value that is consistent, and yet it isn't. It depends where we are at any one time. Time inconsistency is the jargon for that finding. Let's do another one. Let's go shopping. Now, dollar's not in great shape these days, so we're going to go shopping in America. We've arrived there to go on holiday, or vacation as they would call it over there, and we've forgotten to buy a digital camera, but we were thinking we were going to replace our camera anyway. So we walk into the first shop, or as I should probably call it, a store. And now, here we go. The first thing we're offered is the S750. We decide to buy a Sony because we think that Sony is a decent make. So we're going to buy a Sony, and we're offered the S750. 7 megapixels, not bad there. Not bad at $127. But we're also offered the W150. Now, that's got 8 megapixels, and it's got a much bigger liquid crystal display on the back. Okay? So we need a new camera, that's our choice. It's 8 megapixels versus 7, better quality picture, bigger liquid crystal display on the back. Now, who's going to go with the S750? Okay, and who's going to go with the W150? Yeah, about 50-50. Okay, now obviously we're good consumers. We're all told to shop around these days. We're good consumers, so we're not going to just stick with one store, we're going to go into another store. And when we go into the other store, what we find is that exactly the same cameras, if my animates work, are on offer at exactly the same prices, okay? But, now the W290. Now that's a really special model. That's 12 megapixels. That's seriously high quality we're talking now, okay? It's got a beautiful liquid crystal display on the back, very high resolution, much easier to judge your photographs. You know, it's really, really good camera. Only 249 if you really push the boat out. Now, as some of you may already have realized, the big question is not will you buy the W290. The big question is which of the other two will you now buy. Who's going for the S750 still? Stick by your choice. Who's going for the W150? Yeah, what happens when you do this for real is that the existence of this one, even though people don't buy it, makes more people choose that one. Okay? Now again, according to an orthodox economic view that says we behave rationally, that simply shouldn't happen. The existence of the third product that you won't buy shouldn't influence your choice between the other two products, and yet it does, and the effect is very large. It makes a really big difference. Now, I think I know what's going on here. I think I'll hazard a theory here. I think we actually use the signal of the range of the range of products as a signal. We use it as a signal as to what everybody else buys, and we use it as a way of assessing the spectrum of the product range. And most of us don't like to be right down the bottom of the product range, and we don't like to be right at the top either. We think we probably belong somewhere in the middle. And what happens is when you give people a range, they move towards this. Anyone involved in the marketing industry already knows this secretly. A lot of that high-end stuff doesn't really make a profit. What it does is it moves people up the value chain. So, all I've done there is given you a smattering of some behavioral economics findings. This is what behavioral economists do. Right? We give people scenarios, we do experiments. Some of them are done properly in the field. We actually set up stalls and we go out and sell stuff and buy stuff. Some of them are just done in laboratories. Some of them are done for real money, some of them are done for hypothetical money. It actually doesn't make a fat lot of difference. You get the same kind of results. And there are now hundreds and hundreds of results that point in the same direction. And what they point in the direction of is those assumptions about the rationality of our economic behavior and our independence from each other. I'll come back to self-interest in a moment. And the reason I say independence is because that last finding there seems to suggest that we're caring about what other people buy, that we care about what that range of products is. I'll give you some more examples to do with independence shortly as well. But what it suggests is that we aren't simply rational calculators who know the value of everything and calculate what we want rationally. Familiarity matters to us. We are more likely to value what is ours. We are more likely to value what we know already. We value the immediate more than we value the future. We don't like risk unless it's to prevent losses. And we're influenced by the valuations of others. There's one fantastic experiment, which I can't unfortunately really do, and it's very difficult actually to get it past an ethics committee, which is that if you put 4 or 5 people into a room Okay, and you ask them which is the longer of 4 lines when it's absolutely clear that one of the lines is longer than all the others. And you set up the first 3 people to answer the question to say that it's not the one that's very, very clearly longer than the others. The 4th person, who of course is the stooge in all of this, the 4th person will quite frequently tell you that a line that is very, very clearly shorter is actually longer than another line. We are so influenced by the judgments of other people. It's a very famous experiment, that one, actually. And if you ever get people to value an object or take a decision between 2 products, A and B, right, if they have to do it immediately after several other people have just done it, they are always influenced by the behavior of the other people. We don't behave independently. We use the valuations of others. Now, according to orthodox economics, this behavior is irrational. Now, I'll let you into a little secret here. Behavioural economists are, I wouldn't describe it as a fight, but there's an intellectual battle going on within economics at the moment between the people that believe this behavioural stuff, as I do, and the people who want to stick to the orthodox models. And I'll let you into a little secret. Actually, there's a lot of division between the behaviouralists as well, even though we try and pretend there isn't. And it's really about this. It's about whether these are mistakes. Richard Thaler, the author of Nudge, frequently talks about humans making mistakes. Now, I belong to actually the other camp of behavioural economists. I'm not sure whether these are mistakes at all. I actually suspect, and part of my research is about trying to show, that what might be going on here is that what we have defined as rational and what economists for years thought was rational behaviour isn't actually rational behaviour at all. That these behaviours that appear to be psychological quirks are not. That what they actually are is that they're adaptations. We live in an extremely uncertain economic environment, and that these behaviours might actually be quite sensible in a world where it's very difficult to value things, and when we live in a social world where everything we buy comes from somebody else and is watched by others and other people are doing the same things we are. I'm not going to go into that anymore tonight, but that's just to tell you that that's going on. It's not a simple thing of do you believe this stuff or not. There's also divisions about what's really going on here. Why are we getting the results that we're getting? Now, I've dealt with kind of some examples of the kind of things that we do as behavioural economists and how it questions these assumptions about rationality and independence. I now want to move on to motives. I'm going to spend a little bit longer on motives. I just need a bit more water. So that other assumption, which is key, is about people's self-interest. So, let's play another game that tests that. This is where the fun really starts. Here's player number 1. That's you. I've given you £10 again. Here's player number 2. Now, I've given you the £10, and if you like, you can simply walk away with it. You can go off to the pub, do whatever you wish to do. You can simply take it away with you, okay? On the other hand, if you would like to avail of an investment opportunity, potentially, you can, okay? If you like, you can donate a proportion of your £10 to player number 2, okay? Now, it can be whatever proportion you like. It can be £1, it can be £10. Okay, you can donate however much you wish. What happens if you donate any, though, is this. I treble it. So if you give your full £10 to player number 2, I'm going to treble it to £30. I am then going to turn to player 2, and I'm going to say, you can now return some of that money or simply leave with it. So player 2 then has the option of giving you some of that money back, or even all of that money back, or simply walking away. Now, for the moment, you're player number 1. What do you do? £2.50. You give him the whole tenner.
I'm a venture capitalist.
You're a venture capitalist. Yeah, you are indeed. Watch out for that smile there. Okay. Trust no one. Right, that's someone walking away with their tenner. I didn't hear who it was, but
Give all the money to player 2. Give them all.
give it all. Okay. Suppose you don't know them at all. They're a total stranger. Who would donate some of the money? Who would donate all of the money? Yeah, you're about typical. That's pretty much what happens. Supposing you do donate all the money. Now imagine you're player number 2. So you've come in as a stranger, knowing the rules, and you know the rules too. A stranger has given you the £30. What would you do? Some people fidgeting in their seat here. A tenner back. Give him 15 back. 15 back.
It's like standing there betting it for somebody. You know, you stand the bet and you say, oh, I'm sorry, I should have put the bet on, but I didn't. There's your statement of that.
Right.
No.
Okay, what happens? You do get a mixture of responses, as we've just had here, but actually quite often what happens is all of the money is donated, it's split 50-50 and then returned. That's a very common response. A very common response as well is that player one is not 100% sure and might donate about half of it, or perhaps, as you said, 250. Right? So they donate part of it. It's like they dip their toe in the water. They're not a venture capitalist, but they dip their toe in the water. Okay? And nearly always, whatever is donated is trebled and some is returned. It's extremely rare that player two walks away. That is even true if you play this game anonymously online. Right? Where there's no reputational effects. You play anonymously online. You can even play it between countries. There's no chance you'd ever meet each other. But if you play this game completely anonymously between human beings in any countries in the world, this is usually pretty much what happens. Now that microeconomic assumption of self-interest is now starting to look pretty ropey, because that really shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen for two reasons. It shouldn't happen for one, because if player one is self-interested and thinks other people are, he shouldn't be giving that money away because he won't see any back. And certainly, if player two's just been given 30 quid, he shouldn't be given 15 back if he's only self-interested. But that doesn't appear to be the way it works when we try to test it. Okay, let's do another one. This is called the ultimatum game for reasons that are about to become obvious. This time, it's not player one, it's the proposer. Again, it's £10. Now, if you've got a proposer, someone else has to be involved, and it's the responder. Now, the £10 has been given to you. You're the proposer on condition that you offer a split. You must offer some of that money to the responder. If the responder accepts your offer, you both walk away with the money. But if the responder rejects your offer, you both leave with nothing and the money's returned to me. You're the proposer. How much do you offer? £5, £5, £5. Anyone not £5? Oh. Question. I mean, there'll be plenty of people in this room who know a little bit of microeconomics. What does orthodox microeconomics say should happen here? What should happen here? I mean, the answer to the question is if the proposer is selfish and assumes that the responder is selfish, the correct answer to that is offer a penny. Because the responder will leave better off with a penny than nothing, and you get your $9.99. Doesn't happen. What actually happens is exactly what happened in here, which is to say that the most common offer is 5. The mean offer, the average, is normally 4 to 4.50. Quite a lot of people offer 3 or 4. Really interestingly, I think, and I'll come back to this in a minute, any offers below £3 in this game are almost universally rejected. Right? The responder would rather walk away with nothing at all, right, than take that unfair offer. Right? Now, I'm going to go into... I'm liking the murmuring here, because I was really struck when I first read this paper. Right? This paper was produced by a actually, he's really an economist, but he tends to call himself a political sociologist, a German fellow called Werner Guth. Produced this paper in 1982, and I'm going to go into this one in a little bit more detail. I've run through a bunch of experiments. I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail. We're going to do some manipulations, because this will really give you a flavour of what's happened in the world of behavioural economics and the world in which I exist, okay? As I said, that was produced in 1982. What did mainstream economics make of that? I mean, that looks like a pretty strong scientific slap in the face for a theory about the way we behave. Right? It's a straight refutation. So what do you make of it? Well, of course, the first thing you do is you ignore it. Right? It's a classic thing that scientific disciplines tend to do. They assume to begin with it must be some kind of anomaly and it's not real. Right? And then after a while, when it's been replicated a few times, okay, we've got to deal with this. We need a theory. What's going on? So initially, people thought that what might be going on was that people were doing what was expected of them, that they were seeking plaudits in some way. They were worried about appearing to be selfish, but as if this was a real-world situation instead of a laboratory game, you know, they would do the thing that they should do and run off with the maximum amount of money. The problem is, again, it holds with anonymous players. You can use completely anonymous players on the internet in all parts of the world. Wherever this has been tried, you pretty much get the same result. Then people say, well, look, maybe it's just an unfamiliar environment. People don't understand. If this was an exchange in the real economy, people wouldn't behave like this. It's just because the game is so unfamiliar that somehow you get different rules. The problem is, with that explanation, is that you can play this over and over and over again until people absolutely and very clearly do understand the situation that they're in, and they're in a completely anonymous situation and can simply walk away with the money. And guess what? They still do it. They still behave in the same way. This I love. If you play this game with little children, I have a 3.5-year-old at home, and I have an almost 2-year-old at home. And the 3.5-year-old is a girl called Maeve, and the nearly 2-year-old is a boy called Killian. Okay? Now, if I gave Maeve 10 sweets and told her she could only have the packet of sweets on condition she offered her brother some, right? I know exactly how many sweets he would be offered. Right? Right? I also know that he would eat it. Okay? And that happens up until the age of about 11. And around age 11, if you play the ultimatum game with kids of different ages, they suddenly start to behave much more like adults. The offers aren't quite as generous, but they become increasingly generous, and the responder becomes increasingly likely to reject an unfair offer. Really interestingly, if they go on to study economics, they regress. This experiment's been done with economics students, and economics students are significantly more selfish when this is done than students. I'm ashamed, as an economist, to say. In fact, people go on becoming more and more generous the older they get. Students are marginally more selfish in their offers and the way they respond than older people. The older people get, the more generous and the more sharing they actually become. People clearly do understand what they're doing. This is something we teach our children. There is some basic fundamental principle at work here. Is it a cultural quirk? No. It's been done on every continent, and it's even been done across what are called a range of small-scale societies. I'm not an anthropologist, and there may be an anthropologist in the room, I don't know, but I understand that small-scale societies is sort of the politically correct term in anthropology for a tribe, which you're not supposed to use anymore. So that's what that kind of means in everyday language. It's been played in loads of tribes and loads of different continents, so really quite distant human societies. Everywhere this game is played, you get pretty much the same result. So finally, I've pretty much summarized about 10 or 15 years of research on this experiment for you there, until you get to quite recently, where people decided, look, what's really going on here is that people are just buying revenge. The responder is buying revenge, the pleasure of getting that person to disappear and not get anything because they gave you such a measly offer is worth paying the £3 for. So what they're doing is buying revenge. Or perhaps the person who makes the offer in the first place is just buying themselves a warm glow, a feeling of generosity. So what economists then decided they had to do was they had to basically say that revenge and the warm glow of generosity could be treated like products, and that what was really going on was people were buying or selling emotions, effectively. So, of course, the obvious experiment to do is ramp up the money. Because if that's true, as we increase the amount of money that's at stake, eventually the responder's going to say, you know what? I pay £3 to watch that person pull a face, but I'm not going to pay 30 if we're splitting 100. So the first thing they did was they played it with $100. What happened when they played it with $100? What do you reckon? You got exactly the same result when you played it with $100. Now, in fact, an Australian economist called Lisa Cameron, and I don't have time to debate the ethics of this, but one of the things that behavioural economists do when they can't afford research grants to do experiments for real with large sums of money, because that's a very expensive experiment to run once you're splitting stakes of £100 and letting people walk home with the money. There's not a lot of point playing the game unless they actually get the money, right? So one of the things that behavioural economists do, and as I say, I don't have time to debate this, is they go to developing countries and do the games in developing countries where the amount of money involved is not a huge research grant, but is enormous for the people who are playing the game. Well, an Australian economist called Lisa Cameron went to Indonesia and played the ultimatum game where the stake that was being split between the proposer and the responder was the equivalent of 3 months' income for the people playing it, and got exactly the same result. So the responder was prepared to give up a month's income in order to punish the person who'd given them an unfair offer. Okay? Whatever stake this game's been tried with, including a stake that big, you get the same result. Now, if there is one lesson I have learned in 20 years of science and journalism, this is it. right? And there ain't no one so clever that they don't get stuff wrong. Here is a man who is more clever than I will ever be. Gary Becker is extremely clever and has won a Nobel Prize in economics for his work on the economics of the family. So a bunch of these experiments, he was asked about them in an interview in 2003, and he said the following. He said, there's a heck of a difference between demonstrating something in a laboratory and experiments, even highly sophisticated experiments, and showing they're important in the marketplace. The theory, he was talking about orthodox economics, is not about how people answer questions, it's a theory about how people behave in market situations. If you behave irrationally in markets, you'll continue to lose until either you change your beliefs or you lose your shirt. Well, we've all lost a lot of shirts recently. I'll come back to that in a few minutes, right? Now, why do I say very clever people get stuff wrong? Why? Because this quote would fail first-year evolutionary science at undergraduate level. Right? This is an evolutionary argument. It says if you behave like this in a market, and he's saying that the way people behave in games like the ultimatum game and that endowment effect game is irrational. He's saying if you behave like this in a real market, you'll effectively be selected out of the market. Some process like market selection, like evolutionary selection, will select you out of the market. You simply won't survive if you have these irrational traits. Now, why do I say that fails evolutionary science first-year exams? Well, because if that's true, we should all have the dental weaponry of tigers. I mean, sharp teeth is an advantage in the world, right? But we don't all have the dental weaponry of tigers. Why? Because it's only one trait. There may be many, many, many traits which allow you to operate effectively in a market, including things like trustworthiness, personability, empathy, understanding, communication. How good you are at sums and solving rational problems is not necessarily the be-all and end-all for how you behave in a market. And the reason all animals don't have the dental weaponry of a tiger is because it's just one trait and it can be beaten by others, like the ability to climb to the top of trees. Okay? This argument is wrong, and you will hear it time and time again from economists who will say that markets select out these kind of behaviors. They don't. And the reason they don't is because of the number of traits that are involved in the evolution of a market. Okay? Now, this argument is more difficult. And it's a perfectly valid criticism of behavioural economics to say, well, look, if you play all these games in laboratories, these are kind of parlor games. They're not for real. How do we know these phenomena occur in real markets? Well, let's come back to the ultimatum game, because that's actually an empirical question. Do people behave like this in real markets? Well, let's try this one. It's a hot day, you're on a beach, and a friend who's on the beach with you offers to get you a beer from the local hotel. And he's not got enough money to pay for your beer as well, which is a bit unfortunate, but he says to you, look, I'll go and get the beer for you if you can give me the money. Okay? Now, what's the maximum you're prepared to pay for your beer? It's 330 centilitres, it's a hot day, it's a lovely cold beer straight out of the fridge, you want it. Okay? But it's from a local hotel, so what's the maximum you're prepared to pay for the beer?
What country are we in? We're back in
Actually, that question I'm going to come back to because it's actually a fascinating question. But let's supposing.
What's the going price?
Let's supposing you're on the Costa del Sol, because it was the first thing that came into my mind for reasons I won't go into. What would you pay? €4. Local hotel. €5, 4 or 5 euros in the local hotel. It's the maximum you pay. So if it's more than that, he's going to come back empty-handed and give you your money back. But that's what we're doing. Okay? Okay. Now, let's change the game. Suppose instead he's going to the local corner shop. There's a shop on the corner of the beach. And he says to you, what's the maximum you're prepared to pay for the beer? £2. Oh, you get your change. I'm assuming he's your friend here as well. Although you were the guy who kept his betting stake, right? No, they kept the winning. Sorry.
I'd still give him a bit more for going because I want to sit down.
All right. Okay. What happens when you play this game is the following. Now, I bear in mind this study was done in the 1980s when this is what a beer cost. Okay. So this was done in the States. And what you find is you get an answer of $2.65 from the hotel and $1.50 from the grocery store. Now, think about that for a moment. Oh dear. That shouldn't happen. Why do we care what the other guy gets? What's going on there is we care what the other guy gets. I mean, instead of just saying, we want a beer, how much do we want a beer? How much is it worth to us? We're actually concerned about how much we pay for it, depending on where it comes from. We seem to care about what the other guy gets. That's the ultimatum game in the marketplace right there. We do care about what the other guy gets. Right? Let me give you some more examples of it. In economics jargon, this is called splitting the transaction surplus. So the idea is the beer might actually be worth, say, it might actually be worth something like $3 to you. And the amount, therefore, the transaction is worth to you is an extra 35 cents of value from the hotel and a good bit more from the grocery store. But the idea is you're splitting the transaction surplus. In that sense, it's just like the ultimatum game. You're sharing the surplus. The hotel wants the money more than the beer. You want the beer more than the money. And the question is, who does better in the deal in the bargain? Okay? And it seems we care what the other guy gets. Another example of this. At Christmas time, almost every Christmas, there are crazed toys that disappear. Right? They don't disappear for 3 times the recommended retail price. They disappear for the recommended retail price. Concert tickets. Coldplay came to play Dublin and sold out online for 2 shows at the O2 Arena in Dublin in 7 minutes. I mean, they could clearly have priced the tickets several times higher, you would think, and sold out. Madonna tried to put the price of her tickets up to £120 for a gig at Wembley Arena. What happened? There was a massive backlash and almost a public campaign against her because she seemed to be gouging her fans for money. Right? We care about what the other person gets. This is my favourite of all of them. When the iPhone was launched in the United States, it retailed at $599. 2.5 months after it was launched, Apple dropped the price to $399. There was such an outcry from the people who bought iPhones, which presumably they had bought because they thought they'd rather have an iPhone than $599. There was such an outcry that Steve Jobs actually had to apologize and had to give money back to anyone who bought the iPhone in the first couple of months at the higher price. So that splitting of the surplus is not simply a matter of supply and demand. It isn't simply a matter of whether you prefer the object or the money. You care about what the other guy gets. I won't go into that because I don't have time. Now, here is a really interesting thing. And this is why I think Gary Becker is wrong on the other point too. I mentioned earlier that this has been tried in lots of small-scale societies, these games. It has. Both the ultimatum game and the trust game, the last 2 I've shown you, have been tried in tribes around the world, okay? And something really interesting happens when you play those games, which is that the level of cooperation and mutual trust and the fairness of the ultimatum game offers is higher, only marginally, because the results are pretty much universal, but there are small differences between the societies. And you get more cooperation, more fairness, and more trust in societies that have more market transactions. So if you're in a society where it's basically people making things for themselves within their families, or there's a chief in that society that decides who gets what, so there aren't transactions and there aren't markets, people behave in a more selfish and less generous and less trusting way. In the societies where there are more market transactions and people are buying and selling stuff, they behave in a more trusting, more cooperative and fairer way. It's precisely the reverse, in effect, of what we've been told for decades, which is to say that markets are not places where selfishness thrives. In fact, quite the reverse. What behavioural economics is showing is that they are underpinned by a bedrock of trust and fairness and cooperation. And that when that breaks down, as it does when somebody produces a selfish offer in the ultimatum game, we punish them for it, even at a very significant cost to ourselves. In Indonesia, up to 1 month's income. This is the kind of reason why behavioural economics is creating some noise, because these are pretty big refutations of orthodox theory. I need to skip on because I'm slightly over time. So I'm going to ignore that for the moment. It really doesn't matter. Other than what I would say is, I like to talk about behavioural economics as being the quest to find our economic instincts, because people's responses in these games are very instinctive. And the reason I like instinct is this. It's ambiguous on the evolutionary question. It suggests there may be some evolved traits at play, but it's not definitive about it. Instincts are also something that you can learn and pick up from your parents and so on. So that's why I like instincts, because it suggests something that's deep and strong, but it's ambiguous on the evolutionary question. This is just quite funny, I think. They've looked at neuroeconomics, I really don't have the time to go into, but they've actually started looking inside people's brains while they take economic decisions. And one of the really interesting things is, if you get on the end of a really low offer in the ultimatum game, so you get offered £2 of the 10, it lights up an area of the brain called insular cortex, which is the same area of the brain that gets lit up if you put a disgusting smell under somebody's nose. Right? These are very instinctive responses that we have. So 30 years after the original behavioural economics paper, what's happened? There's been hundreds of these empirical studies revealing irrationalities. I mean, I've read at least 300 to 350 at this stage. Hundreds of empirical studies showing unselfish cooperation in economic interactions. Yet, most economic models that are working anywhere still employ the traditional assumptions. And many economics students themselves only encounter behavioural economics if they choose to do specialist modules. And it's not even available in some economics departments at all. So I end up saying, well, what the hell's going on here? Right? Now, I'm a scientist, and most scientists are quite sniffy about philosophy. You know, they tend to think that philosophers are those people who drank too much coffee and didn't have to do any real work. Right? But actually, if you turn to the great philosophers of science for help on this question, they give you it. Now, let's have a bit more interaction. Can anyone name any of these people? And Daniel Roach isn't allowed to say because he knows, because he's seen this before. Anyone? These are philosophers of science. That one's Karl Popper. That one's Thomas Kuhn. And that one is Imre Lakatos. And I'm going to give you one quote from each, which is entirely relevant to where we've got to in the narrative that is my subdiscipline, behavioural economics. Popper, conjecture and refutation. When the theory's refuted, it's killed. We need a new theory. Well, okay, there's something in that. Thomas Kuhn wasn't quite such a sort of logical type. He wasn't a rigorous, rational, scientific type. He believed in the sociology of science. Kuhn believed that what actually happened was that science should be treated as a society and scientists should be treated as a society. And that actually what you needed was some kind of sociological change within the community of science for a scientific revolution to occur, for things to really change. That goes back to what I was saying earlier about what happens when the refutation appears and people just ignore it or explain it away. He said, the crises of our time, it becomes increasingly clearer, the necessary impetus for the revolution now underway. Well, I certainly understand where he's coming from there, because I've been pushing this stuff for 4 years, and for the first 2 years, getting anyone to listen was extremely difficult. Now, all of a sudden, everyone wants to talk to me. So, I believe him. I think crisis can make a real difference to scientific progress, and we're sure as hell in a crisis now. Lakatos. There's no falsification before the emergence of a better theory. That's it. See, Lakatos came along in the 1970s and unified the Popperian and Kuhnian worlds of philosophy of science. He took from both, and he produced a unified theory of philosophy of science. In my view, hasn't been improved upon since the 1970s, really. And what he really said was that the problem here is you can falsify, you can find experiments that show the prevailing theories are not true, but you haven't really falsified it until you've got a better explanation. And that's the problem. That's where we're really at scientifically. Okay, I'm going to say something very quick about the crisis because I'm now bang on 45 minutes to here, and I think that's all I'm supposed to talk to. Does anyone know who was in shock disbelief during the crisis? This man. The guru, the maestro, the architect of the modern economy. He appeared before a US congressional committee that was inquiring into the causes of the financial crisis, and he said the following: I made a mistake. There was a flaw in the model I perceived to be the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works. I found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed. Remember what Kuhn said about science being sociology. I've been distressed by that fact. Now, fair play to Greenspan, because what Greenspan is doing there is admitting he was wrong. Okay? And he's right, because it's completely clear that orthodox economics has been humiliated by the most recent financial crisis, which is why all of a sudden everyone is looking around for alternative ideas and why my phone goes more than it used to. Okay? I mean, what happened? Financial traders hopelessly miscalculated asset values. They mistook risk for uncertainty. What do I mean by that? Risk and uncertainty are two different concepts. Risk is something you can put a probability number on. Uncertainty is when you don't know what the outcome is going to be, but you can't quantify it. They thought they could quantify the likelihood that relatively poor people in America would be able to pay back mortgages. In reality, they couldn't, because it's an unquantifiable property. They mistook risk for uncertainty. We can get people to do exactly the same thing in an economics laboratory. The great irony of that, incidentally, is that having done that, having been prepared to quantify the risk of lending to people in America who were previously thought to be too poor to have mortgages, as soon as the crisis actually hit, they weren't even prepared to lend any money to Citibank. Think about that for a moment. Previously who they were lending to, and then suddenly who they won't lend to. What happened was what they previously saw as a risk, they suddenly realized was uncertainty. And as soon as they saw uncertainty and they couldn't quantify it, nobody knew how big Citibank's losses were. No one could put a number on it. The whole whirligig of world finance just crunched to a stop. Those traders also naively extrapolated trends. We can get people to do that in a laboratory too. They copied each other's valuations. I showed you examples of that earlier, on the way up and on the way down. Households took on way too much debt. They extrapolated recent income and house price trends. They valued the immediate too highly, we've seen that, and they copied each other. All of these things we can show in the lab. You can even create mini bubbles in an economics lab by getting people to trade tokens that pay out according to coin tosses. All of a sudden they think they're really valuable, they bid it up because they each see each other paying more and more and more, and then the price crashes. It's a fascinating thing to watch. And I don't have time to go into that one. The key point here, this is just a labour market example that I don't have time to explain. The key point here is that the financial market, the credit market, the housing markets, the labour markets all failed, and they failed catastrophically. And the theories that underpin the idea that those free markets will behave efficiently have therefore been humiliated by what's occurred. But the problem is this, there is a scientific revolution underway, and this crisis has really propelled it. It's made people take my subject more seriously. We no longer are considered to be anomalies in scientific journals, but something that actually matters. Everyone's looking for new theories, but the problem is, we only have findings and we don't have theory. So, from the point of view of policy, what we know is that the data are at odds with our theories and that we need new ones. But until we get them, we've only got the old ones. Lakatosh is right. Now, at least what we do know, and what we should have known, is the circumstance under which they're least likely to work. I mean, what behavioural economics findings really show you is there are certain circumstances under which markets are really spectacularly likely to fail. And that's particularly true when the things that are being traded are things that are worth value over long periods of time and when their value is very uncertain. Those are the ones where the behavioural findings are most likely to apply. So at least we have some idea of that now. And we need to make policymakers more aware of these findings and these facts. This bullet point's a little cheeky, but in the meantime, I think we've lived through a couple of decades where economics has had remarkable power as a social science in politics. And I think that really has now spectacularly come to an end. There is some irony, because economists have never been on our television screens so much. But I really do think that spectacularly this has now got to come to an end. It's going to take, in my estimation, about 30 or 40 years for more behaviourally realistic, good scientific models of microeconomics to be produced based on behavioural findings, because that's the speed science moves at. And I'm desperately trying to produce a decent model of exchanges to explain the endowment effect, and there's lots of other people around the world trying to do the same thing, but it will take 30 years or so before the way we think about the way the economy works has really been transformed into new models. In the meantime, this is what we've got. What we have to do is not trust the old theories so much and open our minds to the possibility that the world works differently from the way that we've been told it works. I'll now finish. Apologies for running over. Thank you very, very much for your attention and for your interaction. Do forgive me a slight advert as I finish. We live in a world where there are more books sold than there have ever been. But if you take away Dan Brown and Harry Potter, it's about equal. And if you take away the top 50 titles, there are fewer books sold than there have ever been. So please, now I have an opportunity, forgive me an advert. And in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention and for listening. Thank you.